Welcome to George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold. Do you ever wonder about the value of your education? Regardless of what grade you're in, George Washington would have envied the opportunity you have for a free public education. Any fifth grader today has more education than he had. In this edition, George Washington, portrayed by Vern Frykholm, will share more about the influence of his limited education.
I've been asked if there was anything in my childhood, other than the death of my father, that impacted me greatly. And I would say, yes, many things. But as I think back about my early life, they were all connected to my father's death. The lack of a father's example in all things influences a young man's sense of right and wrong, and his decisions as a father, a friend, and a leader in the community. I miss the example a father shows when he is in the middle of crisis, the value and confidence he places in Parliament and the Crown, and his response to disagreements, criticisms, and open conflicts between family members and close associates. But most of all, I miss the close personal bond that only exists between a father and his son. And yet I am thankful for my two older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, our family friend, Colonel William Fairfax, and his two sons, which became my closest friends, George William and Brian Fairfax. Their friendships were of utmost importance to an 11-year-old boy with younger siblings trying to make his way in the world and to provide them an example of loyalty to family, country, and God. And yet, there was one other deficit that greatly impacted me, something I struggled to make up for all my life. That was my lack of a formal academic education. My two older brothers went to Appleby's School in England and got a fine academic education. At age 7 or 8, before going to England, they even had private tutors and some private school education. In the colonies, they received basic lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. In England, they learned classical languages such as Greek and Latin. Other subjects they learned were about bookkeeping, geometry, and surveying, which included craftsmanship and map making. My own education was scant compared to them. When I was 9 or 10, my father hired a Mr. Hobby, who was a church sexton, recently come from England to tutor me. It covered some basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it lasted for less than a year and was not very, consistent or formal. After my father's death, I spent some time with my brother Augustine at his Pope plantation. While there, I attended a school led by a Mr. Williams, again recently come from England, and continued to learn the basics. The last organized education I received was at a grammar school run by the Reverend James Mary, the rector of St. George's Parish, across the Rappahannock River from the Ferry Farm in Fredericksburg. I excelled in mathematics and geometry, which laid the foundation for my learning to survey later. However, as a result of my incomplete education, I never felt quite equal to those who had great learning. And I have viewed my lack of education as a deficit my entire life, as others did. To compound my personal embarrassment, my educational shortcomings were a frequent topic of discussion and was open to scorn by some members of the two Continental Congresses. It came up in public discussion before I was appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and again before I was elected to be the President of the Constitutional Convention. My woeful lack of education was even a point of contention before I was elected to be the first President of the United States. I freely admitted, in private of course, that I was conscious of a defective education, which I would not deny since the majority of the founders were university educated. They had spent years reading law and studying the classic. I was one of the few who rose to leadership without mastering any of these subjects. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton served under me as a president. They were all well educated, spoke Greek, Latin, and French, and all but James Madison were lawyers and members of the bar. I was keenly aware of and smarted from a comment that John Adams made as my vice president that I was too illiterate, unlearned, unread for my station.
I'm thankful that George Washington was able to reach the positions of leadership he held in our nation's early years, despite his lack of formal education. Thanks for watching this series on Washington's early life. Remember, if you or your class want to discuss Washington's life, set up a Zoom meeting with George Washington by emailing georgewashingtonspeaks@gmail.com and find more topics to explore in videos at georgewashingtonspeaks.com.